Let's talk about intervals on the violin. Okay, there's only so far I can go. Well, first of all, let's define what an interval is. An interval is the distance between any two notes in music, not just with violin, in any kind of music. In fact, one of the easiest ways to visualize intervals is to use a piano. You can see here on this image what a piano looks like. You've probably seen one before. If we take the note C on the piano and we go all the way up, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C again, we can see that every single one of those white keys has its own name, or its own letter. Each of these are going to be our 7 notes of the musical scale. However, you'll notice there's actually more than 7 notes. There isn't more than 7 letters that we use, but there are more than 7 notes. Traditionally, we use what we call the 12-tone scale in Western music. If you see again that image of the piano, that 13th note would simply be C again. Only 7 of our notes do we give letters to. The rest of them, we use those same letters and we give them an alteration, or what we call an accidental. Either a sharp or a flat, or a double sharp or a double flat. I have them all right here on my tattoo that I got recently. So when I said the definition of an interval is the space between any two notes, that's what we're talking about. Not just lettered notes, but any two notes. So you could play a white key and a black key, 2 black keys, 2 white keys. The distance between them would be considered an interval. Now, how do we decide what that distance is, and why does it even matter? Well, it matters because it's very useful in the actual practice and performing of violin to understand what these intervals are, as well as helping you with ear training. It's a good idea to listen for specific intervals and learn what they are when developing ear training. There's a lot of interesting information out there about the way that we see the world through our eyes and our ears and how that's changed over time. In this video, for example, we're talking about intervals with regards to the 12-tone scale, which is a Western concept, relatively recent in human history, but still pretty old. But that's not necessarily the only way that we can play music. There's been a lot of developments in music and visual arts throughout the millennia. Being able to have a word for 2 different shades of green, for example, has been proven to enable that viewer to have a better perception of those shades of green. I believe it's the same way with music. Having a real firm understanding of intervals and specific ways of hearing music actually helps you hear those specific ways of music. Having vocabulary and understanding of specific intervals and harmonies in music actually helps you hear those intervals and harmonies in music. Like many people say, names are powerful things. So if an interval is the distance between any 2 notes, then there must be so many kinds of intervals. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Specifically today, we're going to be keeping our scope limited, and we're not going to talk about every interval, because technically there are probably infinite intervals. We're going to be talking about the intervals that we use in the 12-tone scale between one note and itself. So that means a unison. If I play an A and an A on top of itself, there is no distance. They're the same place. And the distance between a note and itself, but across a scale. So 1 octave. That's what we call it, and that's simply because there's 8 notes in it, an octave. That's going to be the natural limit that I'm putting on this video, and that's simply because that's basically the limit that I use in my hand on the violin, because outside of some Paganini and some other virtuosic pieces, you don't really use any intervals beyond an octave in the violin, at least when you're playing double stops. So let's go through all these intervals between a unison and an octave on the violin. We're going to be referencing the piano occasionally to help us first visualize this. But before we do that, let's talk about the 2 most fundamental of the intervals in the violin that we need to fully understand. And that is, both of these intervals are what we call a second. In music, there are 2 seconds, that's the name of this interval, that we use very often. There is the minor second and the major second. They also go by an alias. The minor second is also known as the half step, and the major second is also known as the whole step. If we take a look at the piano again, we can see that a minor second is the space between any two keys. So if we have a white key and there's a black key next to it, those two keys will create a minor second, like we have with C and D flat. If we have a key in between two keys, whether that key be a white key or a black key, in this case between C and D we have a black key, then we know that between C and D there is actually a major second, also known as a whole step. An interesting example of this is when we have between E and F sharp. That is also a whole step. That is our white key E and our F sharp key, our black key. That's because there is another key in between them, and that key happens to be a white key, the F natural key. Now, our major seconds, our whole steps, and our minor seconds, our half steps, are going to be regularly referred to in this video. So it's important that you fully understand what those are. Please feel free to replay what we've already gone over to make sure you get that before we move on. Alright, so we know what our half steps are, our minor seconds, and our whole steps are, our major seconds. Now, let's look back at the whole step and half steps' true names. The minor second in the half step, the major second in the whole step. If you'll notice, with both of them, they have the same kind of structure. We have an adjective, major or minor, and then we have a number, second, 2. All of our intervals are going to be designed this way. We'll have an adjective, major, minor, sometimes 2 additional ones, augmented, diminished, and sometimes a final one that is kind of in between all of them, perfect. Perfect is going to be an interesting one that we'll get to a little down the road. Following that adjective, whether it be major, minor, diminished, augmented, or perfect, we have a number. In the case of the whole step and the half step, we use the number 2. And that's because it's between a first note and a second note. If we take the piano again, and we look between the notes C and its octave above, C again, and we take just the white keys, we can see what our regular or our major intervals can be. If we always start on C and we take any note away from C, then we can assume that that is going to be a number followed by a major. So if we go from C to the very next note, or the next white key, in this case that's D, C to D is going to be a second because we start counting from C. C is 1, D is 2. And because we're looking at the major scale, this is the way of memorizing this very easily. We can see that that is going to be a major second. If we go from C to the third note in this scale, C, D, E, that will be a third, and C to E will be a major third because we're in the major scale. All of our intervals that are not perfect in the major scale, starting from the tonic or the first note, in this case C, will always be a major interval. So if we look at the fourth note in the scale, that's going to be F, and we go from C to F, then we assume that's going to be a major fourth. But wait, that's not correct. You may have remembered that one of the adjectives, one of the 5 adjectives that we talked about before, was called perfect. And this is the one that shows up in any major and minor scale and kind of messes up our patterns a little bit. Because our fourth and our fifth and our octave, all of those intervals are going to be perfect intervals. So the space between C and F are going to be a perfect fourth. Between the first and the fifth note of the scale, C and G, that's also going to be a perfect interval. That's going to be a perfect fifth. When we continue on now, though, from C to A, that's going to be a sixth. It's specifically going to be a major sixth because it's the major scale. Finally, when we go from C to B, that is also going to be a major, in this case, seventh, because it's between the first and the seventh note of the scale. Major seventh. Between C and itself, an octave above, it's going to be just that, an octave. And if you want to be specific about it, you can say it's a perfect octave, but it's often going to just be implied. Nobody really says perfect octaves. Just like no one really says perfect unison, even though a unison is technically a perfect interval. What is a perfect interval and why do we call it that? It has to do with the science of resonance, which is far beyond the scope of this video, but in basic terms, essentially the wavelengths of 2 notes that create a perfect interval have a very, very nice ratio. Something like 2 to 1 with an octave, or 3 to 2 with fifths, I believe. I can't even remember off the top of my head, to be completely honest. So, if you take a look at a major scale, you start on the first note and pick any note above it. Those intervals will be whatever number that note is, and they will be either major or perfect. In the case of fourths, fifths, and octaves, they'll be perfect. And in the case of the others, they'll be major intervals. But major intervals are not the only intervals, right? There are minor intervals, there are diminished intervals, there are augmented intervals. And a simple way to memorize this is going to be to work it out from this understanding. So if you know what your major scale is, in this case C major is the easiest one because it's just the white keys on the piano, then you can work out through understanding what those intervals are, those major intervals. We can actually work out from that. We can backtrack, reverse engineer, and discover what minor intervals are. All that a minor interval is, you take a major interval and you make it 1 half step or 1 minor second smaller. So between C and E, that third note in the scale, if we see that, we can move that E down a half step from E to E flat, and that would make it from a major third to a minor third. We could do that same process with any of these major intervals to discover which the minor version would be. We can test this theory with two that we really understand from the beginning of the video, of course, our major second and our minor second, and we can look at the C natural to the D. And if we take that D and we move it down to D flat, that is, of course, going to be a minor second, also known as a half step. All that makes an interval augmented is to move in the opposite direction. So if you have a major interval, in this case, we'll take the same example, C to E. If we wanted to move that E up a half step to expand that interval even further, we could do so, and we would call it an augmented third. In order to be technically an augmented third, it has to be still called an E, because what gives us the number in an interval, remember we have a quality or an adjective, major, augmented, and we have a number, 2, 3, 4, 5, in this case a third. In order for it to be a third, that number has to correspond to the letter of the scale. A third is the distance between C and E. Doesn't matter what that E is. That E could be a double sharp, it could be a triple sharp. I don't even think triple sharps are real. But the bottom line is, as long as it's an E, we'll technically still call it a third. The maximum that we'll call it is going to be an augmented third for most reasonable people. So if we take that E and we make it an E sharp, C to E sharp will be an augmented third. Notice E sharp is also the same thing as an F natural, which is technically a perfect fourth. But because it's still an E, we call it a third. In this case, an augmented third. If we wanted to instead make this third a diminished third, we would take that major third that we know is just the white keys, C to E, and we would move it down, not just 1 half step, but 2 half steps, or otherwise known as a whole step. So we would move it from E to E flat, and then down again to not D. Technically it is a D, but technically you have to say the right word, which would be an E double flat. And if you notice, a diminished third is the same thing as a major second. So these are, again, some of the reasons that you don't often see these in music because they can be quite redundant. So with the purposes of violin playing, I would focus on memorizing your major and your minor intervals as well as your perfect intervals and trying to memorize what they feel like in the left hand. Let's start back with those first two fundamental intervals, our major second and our minor second. These are the most fundamental of intervals, our half step and our whole step, and that is because we're going to think of them in a very specific way on the violin. I specifically think of a half step as the width of a finger. This is obviously going to vary quite a bit depending on where you are on the instrument, depending on how big your finger is, but it's a nice general way of feeling it out. A half step is roughly the distance or the width of a fingertip. So that means if you have one finger down, in this case, we will keep the same notes that we've been using on the piano. We'll start with a C natural, which is going to be our second finger on the A string, a nice low 2. If we wanted to play a half step above that, we would place our third finger right next to it. And the simple width of the third finger would account for the distance we would need to create a half step. If we wanted to instead place our third finger a whole step above that, we would imagine almost as if there's a finger in between them, or at least the distance of a finger. and that's where we would place our third finger. So this concept of half steps and whole steps is going to be very, very critical in creating good hand shape throughout your journey in violin playing. So a whole step in violin playing will always feel like any two fingers that is simply spaced by about a finger width. A half step will always feel like any two fingers roughly just touching and being really close together. When we go beyond that, we start to talk about the next interval, which will be thirds. When we have thirds, as you know, we have a quality of third, either a major third or a minor third. Obviously, there's augmented and diminished, but we already remember from before that those are kind of redundant intervals. So we'll just talk about the two main qualities of thirds, majors and minors. There's two ways to comfortably play thirds on the violin. That's on the same string or that's across a string. Let's start with thinking about how a third feels on one string. When playing a third on one string, in this case, we're going to be playing from C to E natural, that very first major third that we learned about on the piano. We're going to take our second finger on the A string in that low position. And the way I like to think about thirds, major thirds in particular, is that our in-between finger, in this case third finger, is going to be spaced evenly from both fingers. So we have our second finger on a C natural. Our third finger is spaced away, and our fourth finger is spaced away from that. And that creates our E natural. So even though we're not using our third finger for any particular note, we are still using it to create a frame of reference for our interval. This is the essential understanding about how we create good intonation and good habits on the violin. We use fingers that we're not necessarily using in order to create frames of reference. If we wanted to make that E into an E flat so that our third went from being a major third to a minor third, all we would do is think of it in one of two ways. The in-between finger, our third finger, would either be close to fourth finger or it would be close to second finger. In this case, because of just the way that my hand works, it's going to probably just be on that normal D natural and feel close to the fourth finger. So in other words, our fourth finger is going to come down to meet the third finger so that our third finger and our fourth finger are only half steps away from each other, right? They're touching. And that creates our minor third. If we wanted to create a major or minor third between first and third finger, which is also an option, we would follow the same exact principles. We'd start on any note. In this case, let's just do an E natural on the D string. And if we wanted to play a major third, we would have that second finger spaced away from one, and we would have that third finger spaced away still from second finger, which would create a G sharp. E natural to G sharp is a major third. If we wanted to make it a minor third, we would move that top note, that G sharp, down a half step to a G natural. And the way I would recommend doing this is by having your second finger on an F sharp and allowing your third finger to meet it, come down to that second finger. And that creates your minor third. When you're playing a third across the strings, you have the same two combinations of fingers, but the idea is the opposite. So when you're playing our major thirds, you want our in-between finger to actually be close to one of the fingers. So for example, if we take that C natural again, this time we'll do the lower one, middle C on the G string, playing with the third finger. If we want that E natural to sound in tune, then the in-between finger, that second finger, either needs to be close to the third finger or close to the first finger. For me, it's always more comfortable to be close to the third finger. And then we feel like that first finger is spaced away from that second finger. And that gives us our major third across two strings. If we want to bring that to a minor third, we would take that first finger on that E natural and we would move that down a half step. And the way that we do that and feel comfortable about it is by feeling that in-between finger having a space between all the fingers. So we have our third finger, that second finger is going to be spaced down from that third finger. And then our first finger is going to be spaced down from there to find that E flat on the D string. It's also going to be a string over, of course. And that gives us our minor third. After we do our thirds, let's conceptualize what a fourth feels like, specifically the perfect fourth. The perfect fourth is going to be the space between our first and our fourth finger if we're doing it on a single string. If we play between B natural and E natural, that's going to give us a perfect fourth. And the way we can figure out what a perfect fourth is that conceptually, it feels like the space between first and fourth finger where all but one finger is spaced. So maybe first to second finger has a space, second to third finger has a space, but third to fourth finger are close. Maybe first to second has a space, but second to third finger are close, and then third to four have a space. Maybe second to first finger are close and the rest have a space. The bottom line is that we have two spaces and only one finger is close to another. With this concept, we'll always understand what a perfect fourth should feel like. If we wanted to create what we call an augmented fourth, we just take a perfect fourth and we move one of the notes out away from the other. We'll take that same fourth, that perfect fourth, B natural to E natural, and if we move that E natural and we move it up to an E sharp, then we create what's called an augmented fourth. That's otherwise known as the tritone, or the devil's interval. It's a quite unpleasant interval to hear. It's great for creating tension in music. And the way that we conceptualize this interval is by feeling like there is a space in between each of our fingers. It's actually quite a simple interval to feel. After that, we move on to the fifth, specifically the perfect fifth. It's simply going to be when you place your finger on two strings. Or we play opens. The space between D natural and A natural, open strings, is going to be a perfect fifth. It's a pretty easy fingering to figure out. Notably, we can change a perfect fifth. Often we do this into a tritone as well, but we call it a diminished fifth. And that's simply when you take the letter names that represent a fifth and not the letter names that represent a fourth, and you turn it into a tritone. So if we take the notes E natural to B natural, that's our first finger fifth between D string and A string. If we wanted to move that first finger on the A string down to a B flat, but we still wanted that E natural, we would need to use our second finger on that E natural, and that would create a tritone or a diminished fifth. The way that I like to think about tritones or augmented fourths or diminished fifths, they're all the same in terms of how we feel them in the hand. Aside from having the fingers evenly spaced, if we're playing it on one string, if we're playing it across two strings, we feel it in one simple way. A half step, except we feel that that half step is on opposite strings. So our second finger might be on a C natural on the A string, and our third finger, instead of being on that D flat on the A string, we just move it over to that G flat on the D string. We can also think of it as an F sharp on the D string instead, if we want to think of it as a diminished fifth. It doesn't really matter though. The tritone is such an interchangeable interval because all you have to do is take the bottom note and move it up an octave, and it goes from being a diminished fifth to an augmented fourth or vice versa. But going back to fifths, we have the perfect fifth, and the natural way to move from there is to go to the sixths. If we remember from our major sixth on the C major scale, we can think of C natural to the sixth note in the scale, which is our A. That's going to be a major sixth. And when you're thinking about how that feels across the strings, it simply feels like a whole step. We feel simply like any two fingers are spaced and they're placed across strings. So the lower finger is placed on the low string and the higher finger is placed on the high string. You can do that with any two notes, starting on any finger that's not fourth finger on a lower string and placing any finger above it a space away on the upper string. You can take first finger and place second finger up, second finger, place third finger up, third finger, place fourth finger up. That's always how we're going to feel the major sixth. The minor sixth, we simply, instead of feel a whole step, we feel a half step. We just bring either that lower finger up or that upper finger down. If we take that same idea from the piano, that's C to A, that makes the major sixth. Remember that to make any major interval minor, we simply just move it down a half step. We take that A and we move it down to a A flat, and then we feel like it's a physical half step. That's what I like to call these ideas in violin. I like to call them physical half steps or physical whole steps, depending on the situation, and how that kind of manifests into different intervals. Our physical whole steps can represent whole steps, right? If we have a physical whole step, that space on one string, that's a whole step. If we move that second finger or that higher finger over to the string above, we can think of that as a physical whole step. That creates a major sixth. And if we swap places or swap strings, we create a perfect fourth. Those are all physical whole steps that create various intervals based off of our strings. After the major sixth, let's move on to the final interval, which is the major seventh, which is the distance between, in this case, we'll take C again. This time we'll take it on the A string, C natural, second finger. And then we have our fourth finger on the E string for that B natural. The way that we feel a major seventh is by thinking of that in-between finger as being neither close to the lower finger or the upper finger, but rather equally spaced between them. It's the same idea as when we have a major third on one string. We have that in-between finger not touching either. Same idea here. Likewise, if we wanted to make it minor, we bring that fourth finger down a half step, that B to a B flat, and now all of a sudden our fourth finger is touching our third finger, and that in-between finger is being close to one of them. Just like if we have on one string a major third and we bring it down to a minor third, that note becomes close to the in-between finger. So in short, we have our major seventh, we bring that fourth finger down, and we have our minor seventh. I know I said that was the final interval, but we actually do have one more interval, which is simply the octave. The octave is just the same thing as the perfect fourth in terms of the spacing of the hand, except we move that fourth finger from one string over to the higher string. So if we take the A on the G string, that first finger, and we bring that fourth finger to an A on the D string, we have our octave. And for octaves, it's exactly the same as with our perfect fourths, where the way that we conceptualize it is that we need to have one in-between finger that gets close to another. It could be our third finger next to our fourth finger. It could be our second finger next to our third finger. It could be our second finger next to our first finger. It doesn't matter as long as one of them is finding a buddy to be close to. That's how I like to conceptualize my octaves and my perfect fourths. So you can see this was an exhaustive video. Hopefully it covers everything you needed to know about intervals. And if it didn't, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope that you've learned something from watching, and happy practicing. Thanks so much for watching.